We look at why the Philadelphia Eagles should be considered top NFC contenders, all that and more coming up next year on this episode of Locked On NFL.
You are Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On NFL, your daily NFL podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher. I am the host of Locked On Ravens and one of the many NFL experts here on our network, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here, making Locked On NFL a part of your day and your first listen each and every day. Are free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your shows, or 5 days a week of NFL content here. So Monday through Friday, we have you covered all across the league. Today's episode of Locked On NFL is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as the playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's someone for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. We are back here, and on today's show, we're going to be talking about the Philadelphia Eagles, why they should be considered top NFC favorites with Louie DiBiase of Locked On Eagles. Then we'll get into if the Bucs can defend their NFC South title with James Yarcho of Locked On Bucs. Then I'll be taking you through the final part of the show, talking about if the Baltimore Ravens have approached the offseason the right way. So without any further ado, let's first go to our conversation with Louie DiBiase of Locked On Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles had a disappointing end to their 2023 season amidst a horrible collapse, but they're looking to get back on track in 2024. Here to talk about that with me is Louie DiBiase, one of the hosts over at Locked On Eagles. And Louie, I know the Eagles have had no shortage of excitement this offseason, bringing in new names and shuffling around their roster as they try to build another Super Bowl contender around Jalen Hurts and company. But the NFC is a very interesting conference to me, at least, because you have the top teams, 49ers, Cowboys, Eagles, etc. But then there seems to be a pretty big drop-off after that. Now, I expect more teams to jump up this year. But what's your overall feeling on the NFC conference? And do you think that Philadelphia, with their offseason, should be considered the NFC favorites over some of the top teams?
Yeah, this was one of my most favorite off seasons the Eagles have had in quite some time. And they've had some exciting off seasons in the past, even if on paper it looked great and it didn't work out in the end. This year, I love all the moves Howie Roseman made in free agency, in the draft. I think their coaching changes were also a huge necessity. Like, they had to make those changes after what you mentioned. To me, it was a historic collapse at the end of 2023. I've never seen a Super Bowl contender look like a bottom-tier team overnight, and that's who the Eagles were last year. So they had to make a lot of moves to change this roster and this coaching staff up. They made a lot of moves, to me, necessary to make that step to get back to who they were in 2022. Kevin, I would put them over pretty much everybody but San Francisco. It would be hard for me to, after seeing what happened last year at the end of the season, after seeing them get so poorly outplayed compared to the 49ers in that matchup, it'd be tough for me to put them over San Francisco for this year, but I will take them over anybody else. Like, yeah, this isn't the, quarterback loaded conference of the AFC. There's still some really good rosters though in the NFC, but I think Philadelphia has the quarterback and one of those most complete rosters. So I'd say honestly right now, I'd probably put them at number 2. I'd put them ahead of Detroit, Green Bay, Dallas, like those risers, but I unfortunately would have to put San Fran still at number 1.
Well, you mentioned Dallas, who, of course, with the Eagles' collapse, ended up jumping Philadelphia last year. I'm curious to hear, because Dallas, they did some, not nearly the offseason Philadelphia had, in my opinion. But why do you put them over Dallas? I think it is a tight race. I think you could go either or, but in your opinion, why Philadelphia?
I think Philadelphia is on the rise still, and I think Dallas is on the fall. I think they're on the come down, and I think they kind of know that. And I don't know if they believe in their window anymore. It's why Jerry Jones kind of sat on his hands all offseason, didn't give contract extensions to Dak Prescott, to Micah Parsons, to CeeDee Lamb. And I think the only reason they won the division last year is because Philadelphia choked. I mean, this team was 10-1, and it wasn't like they won 10 easy games. They were beating the Dolphins, the Cowboys, the Chiefs, the Buffalo Bills, like the Los Angeles Rams, a bunch of playoff teams in both conferences. To me, that's why Dallas won the division, is Philadelphia, again, had a collapse we've potentially never seen from a team that good over a 2-year span. So not to say Dallas doesn't have still a lot of talent on both sides of the ball, but it just feels like their window is closed and they kind of know it. And we saw them choke yet again in the playoffs. So Not to mention the Eagles' schedule is a lot easier this year. I don't know. I'm feeling the vibes are a lot higher in Philadelphia right now than Dallas.
And for you, you mentioned how incredible of an offseason it was for Philadelphia. Obviously, Saquon Barkley being the big headliner of that free agency class. Was he your favorite move the team made? Do you have another one? What did you like about what they did?
So I love the Saquon Barkley move. And I'm normally not somebody that wants to pay a running back or draft one high in the draft. I don't think that's a sustainable roster philosophy, but this was a rare instance where you could take advantage of a market inefficiency where now the entire league is not doing this. So you could pay an offensive weapon like Saquon only $12 million, which compared to other running backs is still a lot, Kevin, but what you look at compared to a Darnell Mooney contract, for Saquon Barkley, like $12 million is kind of a steal. I wouldn't pay just any running back that kind of money. You have to have the talent of Saquon where you can run the ball, where you can catch it as well. You can be used as a dynamic passing threat. That was a great move. However, that's not the favorite move that I would say in free agency they made. To me, it was bringing back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. When you look at on the field why the Eagles collapsed last year and why they weren't the same team as 2022, they didn't have the turnovers. They didn't have the playmaking on defense. They didn't have the versatility. They didn't have really the swagger, the attitude, the leadership. Every single attribute I just mentioned is what Chauncey Gardner-Johnson brought to the table in 2022. Bringing him back, I actually think, was the move of the offseason when it comes to free agency. The draft is a whole nother story, but bringing back CGJ, I think, is going to do wonders for this football team.
Yeah, let's get right into the draft. You mentioned it. We'll talk about it. Obviously, Philadelphia, with the way their roster is constructed, they've done a great job being able to bring in and keep their veterans. But obviously, rookies and rookie scale contracts are still very important when you have a quarterback on the deal like Jalen Hurts is on right now. Did you like what Philadelphia did, or did you think they didn't address what they needed to?
It's one of my favorite drafts they've ever had because I've been dying for this football team to invest at least one first or second round pick in a cornerback. I've been begging for it for years. Yes, of course, it's the right mentality to believe in the offensive and defensive line and invest most of your resources in those positions. But take 1 year and just use one resource on like a Baltimore Ravens did with Kyle Hamilton a few years ago. Just give me one of those drafts. They finally did it. They took Quinyon Mitchell, the first cornerback they've taken on day one since Alito Shepherd over 15 years ago. And Quinyon was my favorite player in this draft. They had to do that to finally have some long-term sustainable play at corner. It just feels like, not that they've ignored corner, Kevin, over the years, but it's always been the free agent move. It's been signing Nnamdi Asomugha or Byron Maxwell or trading for Darius Slay, and sometimes they're signing James Bradberry. Sometimes that helps for a year or two, but then they're kind of back to square one. Getting Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean in the first 2 rounds, my absolute dream. I would have took just one of them. The fact that they got both in the secondary that badly needed a infusion of youth and speed, I'm over the moon with that class. And
I think the Eagles did what they were supposed to do there, which is take advantage of a crazy cornerback fall. I mean,
a crazy defensive fall. I mean, nobody was taking defensive prospects, it felt like.
No, and especially when you get to guys like Terrion Arnold and Quinyon Mitchell, who were expected to go in the high to mid-teens, and they fall to the 20s. It was an incredible. I mean, to me, that at least signals that, look, they understood that they needed guys there. They took advantage of the best player available, and it filled the need.
Their secondary was not the same. And again, I mentioned CGJ leaving being a huge difference from 2022 to 2023, but it was also James Bradberry was an all-pro 2 years ago, and last year he did not belong in the starting lineup. Darius Slay took a step back as well. The secondary was brutal, and when you ran into teams finally with multiple weapons like a San Francisco 49ers or a Dallas Cowboys, it showed. And it looked like Howie Roseman, that woke him up, and he took 2 corners. And I love the DeJean pick after Quinyon, because while I think DeJean could be a good boundary corner, I think he can be better as that star Brian Branch, Kyle Hamilton type where he's moving across the formation. Having Quinyon Mitchell for the future allows you to have that flexibility to maximize DeJean's ceiling as well.
And now we know, Louie, the offseason is not over yet. Training camp does begin in a couple of weeks, but there's still opportunities for teams to add guys. Is there any position that you feel a little worried about right now, or that you'd like to see Philly add 1 or 2 more guys?
Yeah, I think linebacker is always a position that they kind of go bargain bin hunting. Like, that's just been their MO. I believe in Nakobe Dean and Devin White. I think they have a low floor, but this is the highest ceiling an Eagles linebacker duo has had in quite some time. I think you could probably add another body there. I love the pick of Jeremiah Trotter Jr. in the 5th round, but maybe you bring back a Zach Cunningham who actually played okay last year. Maybe you look in the trade market. I think linebacker is one that I'm looking at. Outside of that, it's, I guess, just depth on the defensive line. I mean, I like what they have still, but it's very young, inexperienced. If they could bring a veteran in at defensive tackle, that would be something that I'm interested in. But overall, this roster on paper looks pretty complete. It's just linebacker is always the question, just because, again, Howie Roseman really just refuses to invest a lot of resources in that spot. And that's something, unlike corner, I don't think we'll ever see change.
And I think after the collapse, Louie, a huge conversation point, you mentioned the coaching changes earlier, was Nick Sirianni and what his future was going to be. Now, obviously, they overhauled the offensive coordinator spot, defensive coordinator spot. But when you talk about Sirianni, is this a make or break year for him, or does he still have a bit of a long runway?
I think it is personally. I was okay letting him go last year because what I want in a head coach, I want sustainable offense for my long-term quarterback. I want the same play caller in his ear every single year. And Jalen Hurts has said how important that is to him. And when you have a head coach that's now giving up, he already wasn't running the defense. Now you're giving the entire keys to the car of the offense to Kellen Moore. It's like, I know there's more responsibilities for a head coach than that, but what exactly is it that Nick Sirianni's doing in Philadelphia? And if he's a culture guy, well, the culture was a main reason you collapsed down the stretch. So I think he's on the hot seat. I think the Eagles, they've fired coaches for less, i.e. Doug Peterson, who was the first guy to win you a Super Bowl 3 years later, was out. So no, if Nick Sirianni this year, if they underperform or collapse again or only get to the wild card round or the divisional round and they get smoked by San Francisco, I don't think that's going to get the job done, Kevin. This team is too talented on both sides of the ball to let your coaching staff hold you back. So this is a very important season for Sirianni. It's just, for me, no matter what, if this is going to be the setup of their coaching staff, I'm always going to want to change, because if Kellen Moore has success this year, he's probably going to get a head coaching job. And if he doesn't, he'll get fired. So you're always going to have this ever revolving door of offensive play calling, just always changing for your $200 million quarterback. And that's not what I'm looking for.
Louie is great. And for more on Louie, check him out over at Locked On Eagles, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up in the second part of the show, we will be talking with James Yarcho of Locked On Bucs. Can the Bucs defend their NFC South title? We'll get to that coming up next here on Locked On NFL. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a booster or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So for MVP votes for the MLB, Gunnar Henderson here in Baltimore, certainly in that conversation. And then if you want football action, I know the Ravens and the Chiefs open up on Thursday Night Football to start the year. The Ravens open up as 2.5-point underdogs. You can bet on that line over at FanDuel as well. Head over to FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. We're back our second segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Monday. Again, really appreciate everybody making Locked On NFL your first listen each and every day. And be sure to make Locked On Sports Today your first listen as well, as Peter Bukowski ends up taking it across all sports. So you got NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, etc. Peter does a great job of keeping you up to date on all of your sports news. So again, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now we're going to be talking with James Yarcho of Locked On Bucs here in the second part of the show. And James is going to talk with us about whether the Bucs can defend their NFC South title. We'll talk about that now. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are looking to defend their NFC South title. In order to talk about that with me today is James Yarcho, the host over at Locked On Bucs. And James, Tampa last season, they beat Philadelphia in the wild card, and they go and they lose in a divisional. But it felt like a really successful season based off of expectations. Baker Mayfield ends up really showing the league why he deserved a chance, and Tampa rewarded him, obviously, with a big deal. That NFC South division, though, it feels like it's Tampa's for the taking again. Obviously, Atlanta, Carolina, and New Orleans, maybe they could make a move, but it doesn't feel likely they could. Do you still feel like this is Tampa's title and it's not really close?
I would say it's a little bit closer than it was last year, in my opinion, because around draft time and heading into the offseason pre-training camp, you know, the New Orleans Saints were like the sexy pick, right? Everybody was high on the Saints. They're going to get back to the playoffs. Derek Carr is going to lead them, and they stunk. Whereas on the flip side, you know, the Buccaneers were, you know, odds-on favorites to be in the running for the number one pick in the NFL draft and take Caleb Williams. And there's already way too early mock drafts giving the Bucs another quarterback, because there's just no belief in Baker Mayfield. But, this is definitely still Tampa's division to lose. They bring back Mike Evans. They bring back Antoine Winfield Jr. They bring in Jordan Whitehead. They signed Baker to a big deal. If in drafting Graham Barton, of course, to help solidify the interior of the offensive line, which was terrible last year. And if any other teams had gone out in free agency and brought in Mike Evans and Antoine Winfield Jr. and Levante David, you're saying, man, that's Super Bowl contenders. Like those three players alone automatically put you in that stratosphere, and it's still not good enough, right? It's all about the Atlanta Falcons and Kirk Cousins and Raheem Morris and the new staff. And it's just like, everybody just take a step back and realize this Bucs team is still loaded top to bottom with talent. And if Baker can just replicate his performance from last year, this is a team that's going to win the division again.
Now, do you feel like Atlanta is the biggest threat to the Bucs, or would you give that to I don't think Carolina's in the comp. Maybe you do, but I don't know. Is New Orleans that team, or do you think it is Atlanta?
I think it is Atlanta, just based on they do have a lot of talent on that team. They have one of the best safeties in the NFL in Jesse Bates. They have Kyle Pitts, who has been grossly misused in his time in the NFL under Arthur Smith. They have Bijan Robinson, who could do all kinds of incredible things on a football field when he gets the opportunity. Drake London, I think, is a budding superstar. I don't have the faith in Kirk Cousins to get it done. We've seen it for way too long. He chokes in the primetime games. He chokes in the postseason. He chokes when the spotlight is brightest. So I don't think he's the guy that's going to come in and really upend the division. Raheem Morris, we'll see how he does in his second stint as head coach. He had one great season with the Buccaneers, but then tapered off and got fired. And it's taken him this long to get all the way back. Let's see how he and his staff manage things. But from a purely talent perspective, I think Atlanta is probably the closest to the Buccaneers within the division. And I think New Orleans is probably just right behind Atlanta, and they can make some noise. They do have, a team that has had success before. They might be able to, surpass Atlanta in that aspect. So it'll be an interesting competition between those three. Carolina, you're probably looking at being in the running for the number one pick again next year.
Yeah. And the good thing for them is that they'll actually be able to pick a number one this time alongside Bryce Young to see what ends up happening. Obviously not great for Tampa if they get the number one pick, but they're still a couple years out, I think. So don't have to worry about those guys. But you mentioned Baker Mayfield, James, and I think it's such an interesting conversation around him because I think everybody is still so caught up with the end of his Cleveland tenure and how that went, and then going to Carolina, going to LA for a little stint too. And he's almost perceived still as like this journeyman quarterback that is like just average to below average, when in reality, he was the main catalyst, or at least one of them, in bringing this Tampa team to win the South last season and getting them past Philadelphia. They rewarded him with that big contract. What are your expectations for him now that you have seen a year of him? He really blew expectations out of the water, and he's able to have another offseason under Tampa Bay and being able to kind of build off his momentum.
I think he's actually going to be even better, and that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, the additions of Sterling Shepard and Jalen McMillan to the wide receiver core. Last year, they went into the season thinking they had a solidified wide receiver 3 in Russell Gage. He gets hurt. He's out for the season. His entire Bucs tenure seemed to be one of constant injury, so that was disappointing that he really couldn't live up to what we knew he was capable of. So you bring in Jalen McMillan in the draft. You sign his Oklahoma Sooner teammate in Sterling Shepard. That's going to help. Then you have a revamping of the interior offensive line. Cody Mauch is going into his second year. You draft someone with the profile that could be a perennial all-pro center in the NFL. You bring in Sua Opeta and Ben Bredesen to compete for that left guard spot. Surely either one is going to be an upgrade over the combination of Matt Filer and Aaron Stinney last year. You combine all of that together on top of, this is a guy that now has a franchise that has his back. He knows he's the guy. He's not coming in to compete for a job like last year. He doesn't have to look over his shoulder. It's his team, and they have handed him that. And I think really that's going to allow Baker Mayfield to play a little more freely and a little looser, which we all know could lead to, a couple of problems here and there. But the relationship that he has with his offensive line, he and Tristan Wirfs are best friends. We're talking like when Baker got the news of his contract, he was out to lunch with Tristan and Tristan's girlfriend and their new baby, and then Baker and his wife and their new baby. Like, they are tight. Then the relationship with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, they love and respect one another. This is a leader on this football team, and being entrusted with that role really for the first time in his NFL career, I think is a huge weight lifted off of his shoulder. Now he can focus on just getting his job done, improving under Liam Cohen. So the offense will be a little bit different, but then, not having to worry about anything outside of that. And he can focus on some of the hate that the Bucs are getting and saying, all right, you still doubt me. I did, 4,000 yards, 28 touchdowns, 10 interceptions last year, won a playoff game. You still doubt me. I got something for you.
How long-term of an option do you feel like Baker can be for them? Obviously, he's got the multi-year extension. Do you think this could be something where, obviously, if he performs well enough, he's going to get another long-term deal, you would hope. But do you think that Baker has potential to be this team's franchise quarterback for the foreseeable future, even beyond this next deal, if all goes well?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind. And of course, the Bucs, they are careful with what they do. They have an out essentially after 2 years of this 3-year deal. After 2 years of this 3-year deal, we could see another 3 more years tacked on if he's playing up to the level or surpasses the level that he played last year. As long as the Bucs are in contention and they're able to continue to win football games, get into the postseason, win playoff games, they're going to continue to trust Baker Mayfield because he's going to be the catalyst. He's going to be the guy leading the charge. And of course, pieces around him will continue to change. Receivers are going to change after time, and the defense is going to evolve. Probably going to have a head coaching change here sooner than later if Todd Bowles actually kind of follows through with what he's been hinting at, that his time is ending and he's going to move on under his own terms. So Baker legitimately could be this team's quarterback for the next 6 to 8 years.
Yeah, which is crazy and will be such an incredible career resurrection, I guess, if you want to call it, for Baker. Now, James, I know the offseason isn't completely over yet. We have training camp coming up in just a couple weeks, but are there any roster spots or positions on the roster that you feel like Tampa should add at or you're a little concerned about right now that you'd like to see some additions?
Still a little concerned about the edge rusher situation. Yaya Diaby led the team in sacks last year. He's going to play a much larger role, so you expect those numbers to go up. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, at this point, he is what he is. He's not going to come out and all of a sudden become a double-digit sack guy. The big question now is, how is Chris Braswell, their second-round pick, going to figure into this rotation? And will Randy Gregory ever show up? The guy missed all 3 days of mandatory minicamp with no explanation, no news, no anything. And the Bucs have said that they are going to handle that internally, but I'm not sure he even gets through training camp at that point. The Bucs, give him an opportunity, and he has a history of some trouble. They're not going to mess around. Jason Light is very diligent about the kinds of players that he brings into this franchise. And if Randy Gregory is going to mess around, he's going to find out, and he'll find out on the unemployment line. So I'm not sure if there's really anybody out there that's going to help the Bucs at this point in terms of a free agency, but that's definitely the most concerning area of this roster is that edge rush going to be able to get it together with the rotation that they have.
James is incredible. And for more Bucs and James, check James out over on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming up, I'll be rounding out the show here talking about the Baltimore Ravens. Have they approached the offseason right? Stay tuned, plenty to talk about on the show. First, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And there are plenty of times where you tend to compare life to others. And I think social media plays a big part in that. And sometimes when you get caught up wishing your life looked like someone else's, for me, I kind of take a step back and look at what I do have. And comparison can be the thief of joy. It's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like they have it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, they probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have so you can start living your best life. In therapy, there are so many different benefits, such as learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries, can empower you to become the best version of yourself, and into those who've experienced major trauma. It's for everyone. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We are back here, our final segment of Locked On NFL. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you on this Monday. We'll be rounding out the show now by talking about the Baltimore Ravens. Me being the host of Locked On Ravens, I will take you through this segment. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about the Ravens, obviously dating back to their very disappointing and pretty deflating AFC Championship loss to the Chiefs. There was a lot of optimism last season for Baltimore, especially here, because of just how perfect everything felt. The roster felt perfect. The coaching staff felt perfect. But the Ravens, they couldn't get it done. The coaching staff didn't show up. Lamar Jackson didn't show up. A lot of people didn't show up in that championship game. And I'm not one to blame everything on one particular person or part of the team. So I'm not going to entirely blame the coaching staff. I'm not going to entirely blame Lamar Jackson. It is a culmination of all of that. Now, there was a lot of conversation about Baltimore's offseason and just how it would look. At the end of the day, I think people here in Baltimore understood a few things are going to happen. One, the Ravens are going to lose multiple coaches because of how good their team was last season. Also, a bunch of players. The Ravens had 20-plus unrestricted free agents. They were able to re-sign a couple of them, but they obviously lost guys. So when you talk about what Baltimore's situation is right now and what they have to do over off seasons, a couple things have to happen. One, they have to hit on a bunch of veteran signings, which they did a great job at last offseason. Clowney and Beckham and Arthur Millette and Kyle Van Noy and all these guys. They hit on those veteran minimum or close to signings. You also have to hit on your draft picks. And Baltimore has historically been a very good drafting team, but it's more important than ever now because of Lamar Jackson on his big quarterback contract. Baltimore having other multiple $100 million deals on their books, Roquan Smith, Marlon Humphrey, etc. It's important. We're able to work with those smaller / rookie scale contracts. But this offseason, it was interesting because, the Ravens, they didn't have the most cap space in the world. They signed Derrick Henry to a 2-year, $16 million deal on the second day of free agency. But that was really it. I mean, the Ravens didn't really make any other big splashes. They signed Josh Jones to be a vet offensive lineman. They just signed Keith Kirkwood, former Saints wide receiver. I mean, it was really Derrick Henry, and that was it for the Ravens. And I think we saw a lot of other teams throughout the league, add a bunch of pieces. And sometimes you don't have to add a ton to be good in the NFL. Where the Ravens, all of their stars are still there. Lamar, Kyle Hamilton, Roquan Smith, Justin Madubuike, Marlon Humphrey, etc. Like you have all of your stars, but that doesn't mean that the talent is just going to be easy to replace. Baltimore's plan this offseason, and it looks like this was it. The farther we get and the closer we get to training camp and the regular season here. So this was the year replacement plans, them replacing their vets with young players and seeing how it works. It's not realistic. Every single young player is going to step up for a vet that has left. It doesn't work that way. There's so many spots, wide receiver, offensive line, safety, outside linebacker, corner, the list goes on and on and on there. But I do think with every contending team, there is a balance between what vets do you bring in to kind of help stabilize a little bit and you have that consistency, and how do you develop your young guys? Because for every NFL team, it's not just a one-year thing. Obviously, we're focused on this season, but you have to develop young talent. You can do what the Rams did. You can go out there and trade all your draft picks for a bunch of vets, and it worked for them. They won the Super Bowl, and that was great. But the Ravens just don't operate that way. They value their draft picks. They value their compensatory picks. So that's just not how the Ravens roll, if we're being honest. So me personally, I would have liked to see the Ravens add a couple more vets, even if it were just on smaller deals. The offseason's not over yet. There are still opportunities. Safety is a big need for them. So guys like Justin Simmons, et cetera, that could be kind of how they operate through this whole thing. But at this point, it just feels like the Ravens kind of just like what they have. And again, there's a risk with that. But if they feel like the young guys can step up, guys like Trent Simpson, Rashad Bateman, Nate Wiggins, who they drafted in the first round, et cetera, then that's on them, and we'll have to see how it all plays out for them in 2024. That's all I have here today, though, on Locked On NFL. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe and follow along, video form, audio form. Coming up, your Tuesday. He'll also be taking you through a bunch more NFL content on this show. So stay tuned. We'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On NFL.